Welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast where we inspire growth, beat down biases, and get into all sorts of good trouble, with co-hosts Jonathan Beale and Britt East.
No topic is off limits as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy.
So get ready to join us for some courageous conversation, because Not Going Quietly starts right now.
Hey, and welcome to another episode of Not Going Quietly, the podcast for outraged optimists and heartbroken healers all over the world, where we surface those searing truths in the name of radical togetherness. I'm your host, Britt East, with my fantabulous co-host, Jonathan Beale. Jonathan, how the hell are you today?
I'm good. We have some sun in the UK. Don't tell anyone. They might want to come and steal it. No, I'm really good. I've recently moved. As you can see, my background is different. And things are perfect and improving. How about you?
Wow, you're getting so good at that. I'm really impressed. For those of you joining us maybe for the first time, Jonathan had this horrible habit in the past of telling the truth when I would ask him how he's doing. And I'm like, no, I don't care how you're doing. I just want to hear that you're fine, or that you're, like you said, perfect and improving. That question has no bearing on reality. Let's keep it moving. So now he's caught on. He's an honorary American. Jonathan, as he just indicated, is coming to us from sunny UK, and I'm actually in sunny Seattle. Although not today. We had a glimpse of sun yesterday. Today it's back to rain. I think tomorrow things will be easing up again and get some sun. And what's really cool is our guest, who I'll introduce in a moment, is also from Seattle. And this is our first time meeting, but so he feels our pain, Jonathan. He knows what it's like to live in the Arctic tundra, the permanent drizzle, and this year has been particularly bad. So yeah. I'm really excited about today's episode. We're gonna get to the heart of something that I personally, maybe even of all the topics that we've been discussing since we started this podcast way back in January, February, this is the one that I maybe think about the most and wrestle with the most, and philosophically, personally, emotionally. And so I'm really excited to pick our guest's brain and get some good old fashioned experience, strength, and hope, and see what we can uncover. So without further ado, let me introduce Travis. Travis Stock, MSW, is a master certified life coach, Equus master facilitator, and teacher. Travis helps others find what creates balance in their lives by first seeking acceptance of what is. He utilizes the Equus experience to connect others with the often forgotten wisdom of the body, which I love that, by the way, allowing for more fully explored and developed choices in their lives. Oh, so good. Travis has a passion for the balance between masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender, and we're going to get into that, and believes in the importance of nurturing a relationship with both types of energy to create a sense of wholeness. Travis brings with him interest and experience in the areas of emotions, the LGBT community, transformation of trauma and shame, interpersonal relationships, family systems, men and masculinity, and living open-heartedly. Travis Stock, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. As you guys were kicking it off with the weather, that seems to be all we talk about is people from the UK or from Seattle. Yeah, so it's definitely back to being a gray, drizzly day, but looks like the weekend is going to be a wonderful weekend, just in time for Pride Weekend here in Seattle.
Amazing.
So I'm excited about that.
Pride Weekend in Seattle, for those of you that don't know or haven't heard me whining for the past 2 decades, is always a crapshoot. It's either gorgeous or it's like depressing,
or 100 degrees.
100 degrees, yeah. So I think
my first Pride here was like 96 degrees, and we're all dying of heat out here.
Yeah, it's so true.
Sounds like I might have to come to Seattle for this Pride.
It's supposed to be in the mid 80s. It's going to be beautiful.
Yeah.
All right.
It's going to be gorgeous. It's going to be gorgeous. Travis, let's jump right into it. As I've told you, we kind of, and our listeners know, we kind of get to the heart of the matters quickly here. One of the things that I want to talk, or that we both want to talk with you today, is masculinity. It is such a charged word in our community, and probably every community. You hear it's like there's so many rejoinders that it requires. You hear about toxic masculinity, fragile masculinity, healthy masculinity, unhealthy masculinity, mediocre masculinity. It's like there's always the word is so charged. It's like we always have to have some adjective to precede it. So people are like, whoa, we know where you're coming from. So with that word, like, how do you think of it? What is masculinity to you? How does that term apply to queer people? Is it separate from sexual orientation, sexual culture, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big topic, and I think as a culture, at least in the U.S., I can speak to is we're really looking at that conversation over the last decade in big ways with movements like Time's Up and Me Too and Black Lives Matters. We're looking at sort of the unsustainable path that we're on as men, and I like to differentiate masculinity from masculine and feminine energies to start. Masculinity being the social constructs that we as men or male identifying people are asked to demonstrate and present as. It's the sort of the social rules of the game for being a man in our culture. Whereas masculine and feminine energies, as you read in my bio, I see them as separate from our gender. They're sort of the yin and the yang parts of us. They're the parts of us that are deeply connected to our own goals and are achievement oriented and can move directionally forward, that being the masculine. And then the part of us that belongs to a community, the part of us that belongs within systems, the parts of us that care about others, that's the feminine side of things. And so I think that gets confusing because we use language like masculine and feminine to describe something that's outside of gender, but it really often connotates for people the gender binary. And being a queer person in the world, I think it's important to sort of highlight the difference between those things, because our community is sort of disrupting and undoing sort of the rigidity of the boxes around our gender expression and gender identity. And so I am looking for better language for how to describe that at some point in my life. That's the best I have right now. But I also think it's just important to differentiate masculine and feminine from masculinity itself. And so I think that as a little boy growing up, as a queer boy in this world, I did feel like masculinity I wasn't represented within it. And somehow I had failed as a man from the moment I came into the world because I'm gay. And so it felt like a topic that I wasn't a part of and that I didn't have a voice in and that I didn't get to have an opinion about and didn't get to have thoughts about. So, and I think a lot of queer people feel that way. And then you get to see, in the gay male community at least, you get to see a lot of romanticization of masculinity and setting it as the pinnacle. In some ways, it's just kind of like we were raised in a culture that set masculinity as the pinnacle for in the broader culture. And so we as gay boys adopt parts of that and see our value as being able to at least perform masculinity better than other people. And yet for me, it's like, wait, we already broke the rules of that. We already got to jump out of the man box. Why are we putting ourselves right back in that man box? Why don't we get to be more whole expressions of ourselves rather than the sort of limitations that masculinity puts on us from really early on, like boys don't cry, boys don't play with certain toys, boys don't wear certain colors, boys don't care about the people that they are interacting with. They're just supposed to go after their goals in life. So for me, it's a big topic, and it's something I'm really passionate about, is helping to evolve the conversation around masculinity. But as you said, with the whole isms that go, or the adjectives we use to describe masculinity, I want to do it in a way that's psychologically safe so that we can actually look at the hard stuff and try to make some changes and create some new paths forward for us as men.
That's really beautiful.
I'm curious as to what psychologically safe looks like in terms of, describing it, because, my experience has been, I can't speak for the US, but I can speak for the UK, and there's a lot of that. I remember, I'm going to share a quick story just because I think it's pertinent. Growing up in a fairly liberal family, fairly forward-thinking family, fairly queer accepting family, was definitely still brought up around men's men who focused solely on one particular aspect of masculinity to define what a man should look like. And so I suppose I'm really curious about, in terms of psychologically safe, when we're talking about breaking down so many of those stigmas, stereotypes, how do we begin to approach psychologically safe around masculinity in environments that are so heavily influenced by stereotypes and stigma and everything else attached to it?
Yeah, I think we really have to look at our relationship to shame as cultures, because I think part of what makes these conversations so psychically unsafe is that there's so much shame embedded in them. There's so much who has masculinity, who doesn't. It's sort of a zero-sum game of like, I have to take it from you in order to have it, and I have to prove that I'm more masculine than you are. So there's some shame elements to those sort of power dynamics that play out. But then even on the conversations when we're talking as a broader culture around toxic masculinity, that word of toxic already embeds a little bit of shame in there, because it doesn't leave space for certain people to embody certain qualities that fit within the stereotypical norms of traditional masculinity, while also being open-hearted and kind and emotionally literate human beings. And so when we immediately use accusatory language like toxic masculinity, I think there's value in that. And I don't necessarily know that everybody needs to be having the same kind of conversations that I'm having. There's value in calling out bad behavior. There's value in highlighting what isn't working. For me, though, I really want to be having conversations where we're actually acknowledging what's not working, but painting a picture of where we're going forward. And in order to do that, I try to really work on removing shame from the conversations that I have, that acknowledge that we're all brought up in systems. We were all taught things. We're all in some ways have a wounded little boy in us that is sometimes steering in ways that we're not even conscious of and aware of. And so if I don't want my little boy shamed for the mistakes he makes and for the challenges he learned growing up, I don't necessarily want to shame other men's little boys either, because I just don't know that that actually creates the ability to have a dialogue and to move us forward in any real effective way. I grew up in a family that also that was pretty accepting, liberal. I grew up in a reconciling congregation of the United Methodist Church, so gays and lesbians were having commitment ceremonies performed in the church that I went to. And yet I still internalize this culture's story about my lack of worth, or having less worth than other men in the world, because of the broader conversations that were going on. As a sensitive little boy, I internalized a lot of those conversations. And so it's hard to, even when you grow up in a really supportive family, it can still be really hard because the broader cultural conversation isn't very psychologically safe for us as queer boys to even exist or to belong. I mean, we're getting another round of it as like sort of the Florida Don't Say Gay bills are coming through, as like our lives are in question again. Our rights as human beings are like, just the ability to speak about our existence is in question again. And it's inevitable that we're going to internalize that. And so that's an example of not a very psychologically safe space, where you don't even get to potentially exist in the lexicon. But I'm trying to go in the counter direction of removing the shame out of the conversation so that we can actually move forward together.
It's so beautiful. I mean, you are obviously so kind-hearted and loving, and I love all of the space that you create and the way that you language this and talk about it and hold space for everybody from all walks of life. And you kind of attach it to your role as a healer. And you allow space for differentiated roles. Like, I think of myself as more of a provocative performance artist and activist. And so the way I language this is, in my day-to-day world is, like you said, likely a lot different than you might given your work. And I think that's really beautiful. This work requires people to it's a multifaceted approach, and it requires people to work in their lane wherever that resonates. And I would encourage people that might be inclined to move through the world like me to really think about what Travis is saying. I mean, what do we not want these people to heal just because society deems them quote unquote masculine, whatever performative trait that is? Do we not want them to do we not see them as equal? Do we want to punish them? And so I think that's a really important ongoing meditation for all provocative activists to really hold dear. And you did such a beautiful job expressing that. What I'm kind of left wondering, Travis, is, and you alluded to this at the beginning even in searching for a new language, is why gender anything? Like, what is the value or utility in it other than being efficient? I mean, I get where these labels evolved. It's part of patriarchy, but why do we cling to them? And what is the value at like calling this? If we all have masculine and feminine traits, then why not call them something different that maybe is less likely to at least inadvertently participate in straight supremacy and the patriarchy?
I don't know why we cling to it. I do know that I choose to utilize that language because that's where we're at now. Instead of speaking out in the future where I hope we will get to, which certain amount of people will have access to being able to envision a reality where gender is not a part of the conversation, at least as much as it is currently. I want to speak to the people that are still on that journey, and I still want to use language that's accessible, that we have grown up in and understand. And so I make a conscious choice, while I also want to find new language that describes what's ahead of us. I also value meeting people where they are, and I think we are at a place that's still pretty gendered in our conversations, and so that's a choice that I make. But I appreciate you acknowledging like the differences in our approaches to how we have conversations around this, because I think both are important. I think we can all play different archetypes. There's the provocateur, the disruptors, the people that create enough noise to get the conversation visible and seen. And then there's the people in the trenches doing some of the heavy lifting, the like policy change stuff, the cultural movement kind of things that are more sustainable and that are following through on the initial spark of a disruptor. I think we can all play different roles in that, and that's just a role that I choose because I notice even in my own family of origin, who is very liberal and very left-leaning in terms of politics, as soon as we start having the conversation around gender identities for people, it gets confusing. And so it gets hard for people to access that because they've lived 60 some years not ever having to have that conversation or never even having to think about it. And so it's just a choice that I make, is to stay in that language so that I can meet people where they are and help take incremental changes towards something new.
That's really cool. Do you think there's like a hierarchy of quote unquote masculine behaviors? Like, it feels like in society, there's a hierarchy of bodies. In fact, that's a term that Sonia Renee Taylor coined to describe the way people are socialized and treated differently based on their appearance and abilities and physical differences, whether that's race or other types of abilities. Do you think there's something similar with masculinity? Is there a hierarchy within the straight supremacy that we're living in within queer culture that prizes certain masculine traits and punishes others?
I think if I reflect on our community as a gay male community, there's definitely hierarchies of how people present themselves. And then they may even present themselves physically and in images as masculine, but then their voice is a bit more effeminate. And then it becomes a critique of that. So there's like masculine and masculine presenting and performing. Then there's masculine presenting, but not as masculine performing. And then there's somewhere in the middle, and then there's more femme. Like there's lots of different hierarchies. But I do think there's an interesting. I'm more focused on how we use the feminine, how we use femininity as the biggest judgment of each other as men, the way that we haze each other into upholding this man box and this masculinity thing that we're all supposed to perform, is that we feminize men that don't. And so we call them a sissy, we call them a girl. This happens from such a young age. As little kids, we're always calling each other names that feminize each other. And that's a hazing ritual. And so it's interesting to think about what are the long-term consequences that land in the subconscious when we demonize or when we make the thing that we're supposed to avoid femininity. And there's what about the people in this world that exist on the feminine spectrum? What message does that send to them? And so while I do think that there are hierarchies even in the masculinity piece of things, I'm still really focused on there's a bigger wound that's present for me that is really about how one type of energy being masculine is acceptable and one type is not, and that's the feminine. And I think it's something that I really keep landing in, that it feels like strong language for me to say this, because I want to create space where it's not so inflamed, but I think it's actually true to say that the way that we as boys are raised, at least in the U.S. culture I can speak to, is inherently traumatic. It asks us to divorce ourselves from pieces of ourselves so that we can perform a version of ourselves to be socially acceptable. And that's inherently traumatic, to have to leave parts of yourself behind and to never get to explore, experiment, try on different aspects of yourself, and to be shamed every time you step out of line, and to shame each other every time somebody else steps out of line, and to shame ourselves eventually. And so I think that's where my focus is on how we have created this world where only certain types of behaviors and ways of showing up in the world are acceptable, while others are unacceptable and need to be shamed out of us.
Yeah, I would say that the UK has a very similar problem. In fact, I would suggest that.
Yeah, I would imagine.
My own expressed femininity was suppressed from a very young age. I'd get called a fairy and all of the feminine things, and it probably took me about 20 years to really reintegrate my feminine. And so there was a question in there, and it will come to me in a minute, I'm sure. How do we begin to reintegrate? How do we begin to accept those parts of us when our entire lives have been essentially it's been attempted to be beaten out of us? How do we begin to integrate, to accept, to step into?
It's a really great question, and it's something that I'm still figuring out for myself and in my work with clients, because if you've learned that so early on in your life, in some ways you've never experienced something different. And so your coping strategies and the parts of yourself that you left behind, you're not even necessarily aware that they're not there anymore. And your identity has become intertwined with your coping strategies that you've learned to adopt in order to survive, belong, receive love in our cultures. And so it's a really hard thing, because if your identity is interwoven with those coping strategies, it's really hard to tell what's me and what's the coping strategy. And so I think in terms of being able to just, I often start with men around the concept of emotional literacy, emotional agility. What are they feeling? Helping create a lot of language around feeling, because that's one of the earliest stages that I see that we start to haze boys into a certain thing, is to say, you can't feel, you can't cry, you can't be weak, you can't show vulnerable emotions, you can't be afraid of anything. And so when we haven't practiced our skill set for even identifying what we feel, or that we even have feelings, then I think that there's an opportunity in there to use that as the doorway in, to start developing some language, to develop some awareness of our own emotional landscape, so that we can start from that place, because that inherently within our emotions, that's part of the feminine, our ability to feel things. And I really want to encourage men that there's more, it's not a subtractive game to add more awareness of your emotions. It's actually a more additive game. It adds more complexity and more skill sets and more availability to the world, and to feel the world and to make adjustments based on what you're feeling. And I think most of the time we're all afraid that it's going to subtract and we're going to be less than, we're going to have less power, we're going to be feminized, we're going to be rejected by our culture. And yet, in my experience, it's been very additive to my life. It's been very supportive in me being able to create a career and to do the work that I do with clients, and to keep feeling my way through a tough landscape. I mean, it's pretty hard to be a human right now. I really resonate with the beginning of what in your intro around sort of heartbroken healers. Like, I really resonate with that. It's hard to be a human right now. It's hard to watch all of these things going on in our world and to not see very many of your own value systems like on any level of platform out there. And so it's really hard to be that way. And I think that being connected to my emotions is actually what's helping me survive and to continue to navigate this world, rather than to being cut off from that and then unaware of what I'm actually feeling and needing in any moment. So I think emotions is the place I often start with men.
Yeah, I love that.
That's incredible. I identify as a sports loving sissy, and I have reclaimed that word and use it subversively. So I'm a proud sissy, and I lift weights 5 days a week. I play the flute. I write poetry. I watch sports all the time. I know a lot about sports, so it's like I can navigate multiple worlds. But that has come at a personal cost, which in some cases has even turned violent, because when people first meet me, they encounter somebody they tend to socialize as masculine. But then as I continue to display my inherent intrinsic traits and states of being and share my energies, they're like, whoa, this something is not right. And that immediate confusion, once I violate the boundary that in some cases they set in their mind, has led to confusion, verbal violence, physical violence, all sorts of different experiences. What I want to suggest to the audience, and what I have found personally, and Travis, I think you can also speak to this, is that because of that potency, the converse is also true, meaning that what we will call masculine men, maybe they're cis, maybe they're straight, whatever, they have a lot of magic and healing energy for the world because of that. When they are able to paint with a richer, fuller palette, then they have so many gifts to give. One of the things that we talked about in a previous episode, we were talking with a straight cis man on this topic to kind of get that perspective, and I shared a famous meme and video that went around pre-pandemic, where straight dads were marching in gay pride parades, giving free hugs, and strangers in their middle age would collapse in their arms in a puddle of tears. I mean, that's powerful. This is some stranger walking down the street, and he just has a T-shirt on that says "Free Dad Hugs," and people lose it in the most beautiful way. And so one of the things that I love about what you're saying, Travis, is that there is so much magic and healing and love to tap into when we create space and allow people to be all of themselves, regardless of if we deem it masculine or regardless of if we deem it feminine, or however we label it. Like I said earlier, what do we not want these people to heal? Do we not want them to experience love? Like you alluded to, our culture is so combative at the moment because we have people who are finally taking up the space that is their due. But an unintended consequence has been, in some cases, to create unnecessary adversaries and to weaponize our past, even inadvertently. And so, Travis, I wonder, I mean, you have such a lovely, kind, intelligent energy. I wonder if you have any advice for us about how we can do that, how we can, even if we've experienced pain and trauma and harm and shame at the hands of what we will call masculine or straight supremacy, however we want to label it, how can we, as we heal, as we develop our agency and learn to be more fully expressed, how can we ripen into a place where we are able to approach all people with a sense of gentleness and kindness and acceptance?
I love that word that you just used, ripen. For me, that feels aligned with what I would, a little bit more aligned with the feminine energy than the masculine energy. I think the masculine energy teaches us that there's a problem and a solution, and we have to find the solution to the problem. And so I think that's often what we're in the middle of, is we're looking at problems and needing solutions, problems and solutions, problems and solutions. And yet, there are some things that are more nuanced and more complex than just a problem and a solution. Some things need to develop. Some things need to ripen. Some things need time and care and support in order to blossom. And so I think that when we get out of balance in our masculine energy, not masculinity, but sort of the masculine energy of that we all exist, we get a little isolated out there alone, become a lone wolf, and our thinking gets really black and white, that there's a problem and a solution. The way that I tend to start to think about how do we create spaces for ripening is to bring that out of balance masculine into more balance by incorporating some of the feminine energy in there, so that our thinking can be more flexible, so that we don't have to put things in boxes, which the mind, our human mind, is really good at doing. It wants to categorize things, put things in boxes, and to make sense of the world. I learned a new word recently that I'm adding to my vocab that I really just enjoyed, which was heuristics. It's the mental shortcuts that our brain does in order to go faster. And so it often hijacks us, where we categorize something and we immediately move in on our assumptions and move in, and it helps our brain move faster. Our brain needs that strategy to be able to effectively meet every moment of the world. But it also limits us, because there are a lot of assumptions in there. There's a lot of pre-biased judgments in there. And so when we think about when we, like, as you were saying, Britt, that people sometimes make a assumption based on your first presentation, and they miss some of the nuance, and then their sort of reality is shattered when you become a more complex and nuanced individual than their first interaction with you. How do we create safety for our own selves, and how do we normalize that that's an important part of the process, that our first read on something is important, it is valuable information, but it's not the whole picture? And how do we allow even our thought process about things and about people and about gender and about masculinity and femininity, how do we let those things, as you said, ripen? And to gather more information over time and allow our opinions and thoughts to change based on that information, rather than just locking in on something and staying there completely stuck.
I'm a little bit curious on something popped into my head then, because it just reminded me of cognitive dissonance, right? You're presented with something, the reality is very different. Our brains can't really cope with that. We're expecting something and we don't see it. And so the bit that I'm most curious about in there, and I think it's really prevalent at the moment, is that when a lot of people are faced with that cognitive dissonance, the place they go isn't curiosity, it's anger or fear or
so true.
and I wonder how we deal with that on an individual basis when our experience is that people are angry or afraid because we're not who they think we should be, or they're not who a group of people think they should be, or how do we begin to work with that on an individual basis?
Yeah, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of ability to go inward and to notice what our assumptions are, notice what we have, the story or the image we projected onto other people, and then to actually check in with how does this person in front of me actually match or not match the image I had in my mind, and and we have to make it okay that sometimes it doesn't match what we originally put on it. I think that happens all the time in dating world. You start to date someone new and you put this romanticized version on them that you only see their good qualities. And then if you spend any long-term relationship with them or move in together, live with them, and then you start to see all their annoying qualities because we're meaning-making machines. We project onto people all the time, and we create meaning that's all filtered through our own life experiences, our own sort of brain chemistry, our own set points. And so there's something about how do we learn to feel safe and to value difference. And I think one of my favorite ways of bringing people into that is the work, as you mentioned in the intro, that I do work with horses, equus coaching. And so I like to take people out and do experiential learning with a being that doesn't speak the same language as they do. And I take all the normal control mechanisms away. I do have a round circular pen that sort of allows the space to be small enough for the interaction to play out. But now two beings on the ground standing face to face that don't speak the same language as they do have to learn how to be in relationship with each other, have to confront what comes up around intimacy, around vulnerability, around an animal that size, around what comes up when I feel like I don't know how to build this relationship. I don't know how to communicate with this being that's in front of me. I love to take people into that because it's relational, experiential, and embodied learning that really can help develop a sense of putting ourselves out there into relationships, but then also reading the feedback that the other is giving us. And without the sort of messiness of human relationships, it's a little more clean when somebody's interacting with an animal. They don't have as many stories about, oh, well, this horse is trying to do this or this horse is trying to do that, because we sort of inherently know that animals don't live in the same kind of stories that we do as humans and don't have the same relational dynamics. And so one of my favorite things, especially with my male clients, is to take them out and to help them explore the difference between their intention, how they're showing up, what they're trying to create in their world, and what are the intended and unintended impacts that it has on the external environment. So when a man gets to show up in a certain way and they're showing up and they're getting really hyper focused and goal oriented with trying to get the horse to do something they want it to do, and the horse either shuts down or takes off and outpaces them, then they're like, I didn't mean for that to happen. How often is that happening in our other relationships where we're getting focused on something, we're moving in on it, and we're missing out on the fact that the people in our lives are running away from us or are completely shut down and unable to to move forward in the dialogue because they don't feel safe, or they feel pushed. And so I love to help men reflect on their intention and their impact and see, are they aligning with each other, or are you creating unintentional impacts? Because I think that's such an important thing that we need to practice as men, is our empathy, our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And that's how we start to create space for differences, when we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes and see from their perspective, to feel from their perspective a little bit can go a long way when we're able to do that. But we're not taught that as little boys. Little girls are taught that. Little girls are taught how to care for and to play house and to be very relational in their play style. Ours are more about winning, competition, activities that we do together, and sort of winning without noticing the impact we have on other beings. And so I really think that that's a powerful way to start exploring that, is to start looking at where's the gap between your intention and your impact. And once you look at that, how do you start to make some subtle adjustments that allow your intention to align with your impact that you're trying to have in the world?
I really love that. And there's a part in there. I think I keep focusing in on kind of the broader, how do we combat divisiveness and anger in society at large. And there's a part of me that's like, and I'm catching myself, I'm trying to fix the problem. And
problem solution.
There you go. And actually, there's a piece that in what you're sharing there where we get to show up in an embodied empathic way, driven by love, to lead by example and to respond to the world outside of us, rather than trying to control it or lean on our base instincts or the things that we've been taught, I suppose. I don't really have a question in there. I'm just sharing that because I thought it was an important thing to add.
Well, and I appreciate it, though, because it's actually still where my growing edge is as a person, as a human, as a coach, as a person that's facilitating men's work. As a queer person in this world, is that divisiveness and that brittleness can be, for the sensitive little boy that I am, can be really hard for me to navigate and can make me lose my own center and my own psychological safety. And so there are places where I don't feel safe confronting in terms of certain way that men show up in the world, or certain spaces where we are completely at opposite ends of the spectrum. I think, like, cognitively, I think there's value in being able to start taking steps towards each other, towards the center, so that we can actually see each other. But there are plenty of different ways that people show up in the world where I know we're just so far away from each other that I don't necessarily know that I'm going to have an impact in that situation, or have the impact that I'm hoping for. And so I avoid it. And it's because I don't feel safe, because I still have part of my own healing journey to do before I can step forward into those kinds of conversations. And so there's, in some ways, that's, as Britt was saying, the language of ripening. It's where I'm still ripening as a person and as a facilitator of this work, because in some ways the fear makes me really brittle, and my response to brittleness is to avoid. And rather than to be able to step forward and stand in that space and be able to feel safe within it. I think my queer wounding and my my awareness that I'm not physically safe in all spaces plays a role in that. And so I think that it's a place where I'm still ripening and making and finding the balance between sort of like understanding the real risks that are out there in the world as a queer person, but then also being able to create enough psychological safety for myself to be able to step forward in places even when I'm a little nervous or a little afraid.
So beautiful. I love it. I absolutely love it. And what I want to, that's a lot of vulnerable truth in that. And what I also want to encourage you and all of our listeners to do is investigate ways that we can build community most efficiently and effectively, because we're at a critical moment in our culture right now. And I have a theory that I encourage everyone to explore, which is that we can be more efficient and effective when we mobilize our allies into activism and advocacy, rather than trying to convince those that might be experiencing hate towards any one particular group that we are deserving of our intrinsic dignity. So I hear what you're saying, and I think that you can, we can all, I hear this a lot, so I think we can all also be gentle on ourselves. Like you said, those risks are real, and the goal of life isn't to iron out all of our wrinkles of our souls. And there's a lot of efficiency in mobilizing the armies that love us, but they're busy, or they have lower capacities because, they're working 3 jobs or have kids, or they're dealing with the disappearance of abortion access, or they're dealing, there's a lot going on. So, I think that's really beautiful, but the work you're doing, and I'm sure, this is obviously very meaningful. And I'm so glad that you brought up the Equus experience, because I know nothing about it. So I bet a lot of our listeners don't. And I want to explore it a little more, because I suspect you're creating a lot of magic. And I suspect that what men need right now is a little magic, and that you're disrupting the natural, that's not the right word, the socially ordained, the roles, the orders of their life. You're bringing them out of their everyday life into this space, creating a container for them where they can meet themselves in a different light, and then introducing this other being. Now, I'm not, like I said, I've never done Equus. I had an Equus experience, but I did grow up around horses, and I grew up in Tennessee, and that was part of my story. And my suspicion is that that horses weren't chosen by random, like horses have some sort of intrinsic magic to them that help facilitate this work, this attunement process. So you're creating almost a catharsis in these men who aren't used to attuning to their emotional state, and thereby they're meeting themselves for the first time and experiencing benevolent witness in the safe container so that they can then go out in the world and practice it. Is that kind of what is going on here?
Yeah, well, let me first say I would just want to thank you for sort of offering the grace that you offered after my vulnerable share, because in a sense that's creating psychological safety for me. It's just a demonstration that I get to be where I'm at and I don't have to push myself to be any better. There's a perfectionist in me that really wants to always be ahead of where I'm at and to present with perfection. And so I appreciate you creating psychological safety to be where I'm at. And on my podcast, The New Masculine, that's what I'm doing, is gathering allies. I'm talking to people that are already somewhere in the vicinity of where I'm at. I'm not reaching for somebody where we're going to have a debate online. I'm not reaching for somebody that we're so far away from each other that we're not going to be able to convince each other of anything or come to any sort of agreement on anything. That's not interesting to me. And so thank you for just reminding me, the scared little boy in me at times, that I get to feel okay with where I'm at. I get to be as I am, and that's enough, and that I don't have to constantly be a work in progress. So thank you. And then, no, horses aren't chosen randomly. In some ways, we're an interesting species. Like, our two species have really developed over tens of thousands of years together. And yet they're an animal that we interact with on a regular basis, or not everybody does, but humans do, that isn't necessarily in our homes and sort of as bred to our own neuroses as our cats and dogs are. Our cats and dogs are kind of become members of the family that are internal. Horses, on the other hand, are a little bit more connected to their natural instincts, their natural way of being, even though many of them are domesticated. There are wild horses in the United States on the Bureau of Land Management land, the wild mustangs of the U.S., and we don't interact with them very often. But the domesticated horses are safe enough for us to interact with, and yet are still connected to their own intrinsic instincts in the world, and they belong in communities that exist outside of us as humans. Horse herds are still a thing, and while we man make them and kind of put them in their own little herds, rarely do you have a person that has just one horse all by themselves. It's not really a very kind thing to do to a herd-based animal, is to isolate them alone from their other community members. And one of the cool things about them is that they have the emotional center of the brain is about the same size as is in the human brain. So the same capacity for emotional experience and connection with each other, they just do it in different ways. And they belong to communities, much like we as humans do, but they do it in different ways. They view leadership differently. They view power and boundaries and connection. They hold all of those things differently. And so it's this opportunity to go into a relationship with a being that has some similarities to the way that they create safety and belong and exist in the world, but get to reflect on new models for what else could we be doing as humans? How could we be connected to the health of our herds, our communities, as much as we are connected to our survival instinct of being able to have enough to eat and drink and to be able to have enough in our lives. They're both individuals and a part of a collective. And so there's some really amazing things that come along with that. And the last thing I'll say is that they're on the prey end of the spectrum. They are not seeking to eat you. They're not going to often attack you if you do something that is startling to them. They're a flight animal, and so they're much more likely to leave you if they feel something that they don't really enjoy than they are to attack. Now, horses obviously can make some associations if they've had some abuse and will stand up for themselves, but it's very unlikely that they're going to move into an aggressive posture. They're much more likely to move into I've got to hightailing it out of there before they're willing to go into attack. So it just becomes a safer place than if you were to be interacting with a bear or a lion, and you made some sort of quick movement, and then the animal felt it needed to protect itself in a certain way. But also, it's a large and impending, like, it's a large animal that requires a lot of presence for you to be around. They are potentially lethal. One kick from a horse could be really potentially damaging to you. And so something about needing to be present with a being that size that really asks us to show up in the moment in different ways than our actual real lives ever ask us to do. And in that present moment awareness, a lot of whatever we've been pushing down with our coping strategies starts to come to the surface for us to be able to reflect on and to talk about and to be able to explore, how is that working for you? If it's not, let's try on new ways of showing up and see how the external environment, being the horse in this situation, responds to that new way of showing up.
I suspect if you're a person that feels trapped or stuck in a story of masculinity, then those moments of tenderness could be earth-shattering in a beautiful way, could really cause you to question everything you thought you knew about yourself, and give you, and this has been a cliche for years, is that men are quote unquote men are more affectionate to their dogs than their family and stuff. And so I suspect that the combination of this large animal that you're describing plus you as a healer can be really potent and powerful for a lot of guys who've maybe struggled to crack open this can of worms.
Yeah, it can be. And I love that you use the language of magic beforehand, because I've been doing this since I had my first session as a client in this work in 2010. And then I started training and leading, and now I teach it to other coaches. I started that about 2012. And I've been doing it for this long, and it still feels like magic to me. There's times where I'm like, there is no way that we got to this conversation with this person just by standing in a round room with a horse. There is no way we got here, or there's no way that horse could have done that exact right thing that cracks that thing open for that person. So it does feel like magic to me. And as you were saying with men, there's actually a lot of work going on right now around the work with people who are diagnosed with PTSD, working with horses. So it's often done in veterans programs. So the Wounded Warrior programs, or those people that come back from war and have PTSD and have flighty nervous systems that take over. There are actually a lot of programs right now that are taking those type of men into these experiences with horses. And there's something about intertwining our nervous system with another being that has a flighty nervous system. And we learn to regulate with them, and it teaches us how to regulate our own nervous system. And so it can, even the most hyper masculine presenting men who have gone to war, that have been through, who have seen a lot, who may have numbed out, who may be dissociated, who may be disconnected from their experiences. There's something about this experience that with the right kind of facilitation that can really open up something for these men, and that can bring them into a deeper connection with self, and to start learning how to regulate and creating more safety internally. So you're right, it can look like magic and feel like magic, and there's something to the relational and embodied quality of it that's really teaches us something that we can't necessarily learn through the mind.
It's amazing. You know, we've been talking a lot about our own personal growth and development journeys on this road of the kind of culturally constituted masculine and feminine. Now I'm thinking about ways that we can pay it forward and create a healthier society. And, you know, I'm struck by, of course, all of the missing rites of passage, cultural transmission points, ceremonies, initiations that we, especially as queer people, have lost out on, whether it's due to simple homophobia, straight supremacy, or the impacts of the AIDS epidemic, you know, whatever it's due to, the war on drugs. I mean, that's in many ways was, you know, I'm going to guess that the three of us identify as white people. And so it's like, we have to, I think, honor that the war on drugs was basically a war on fatherhood and brotherhood that was waged on Black and brown people. And so they've experienced maybe something similar in a certain vein. what a lot of queer people have experienced in the absence of these role models that would provide these cultural transmission points. So how can we be that change? How can we create a healthier society that we can be part of, and then, make it easier for others coming up?
It's a big question. And I think that it happens individually differently for each of us as individuals. I think in some ways, doing our work to show up in the most authentic ways that we can, by doing our own healing work, by engaging coaches and therapists and any other kind of modalities that actually support our own healing and transformation work, really then gives permission for other men to do the same thing, or other people to do the same thing. And so I think we have to always start with ourselves, and then we start looking at what am I really, what are my sights set on? What are my values telling me is the place that I can make an impact? It's why I started my podcast, was because that I started thinking about, how do I want to participate in men's work? And as you were sort of pointing out, as queer people and like hetero supremacy kind of stuff, there's a lot of men's work communities that are out there right now that still, when I look at them, the makeup of them is still cisgender, heterosexual, mostly Christian white men. Men of color are not feeling safe being in there. Queer men are not feeling safe in there. And so there's actually very few communities that are doing the work to invite in other voices, that are asking others to be a part of it. And so when I kept looking, going I really want to go to that, but I don't necessarily know that I feel safe being in a room full of straight men, being the one gay guy there. I don't know what I don't want to continue to have to do my work in such a almost violent to self way. I want to start creating work that feels safe and that feels nurturing, and that I can heal within, and that I'll invite others to come into that space. And so I think, because I started noticing where my vision was being trained to and where my mind kept drifting to, then I started to pick a zone and a lane where I felt like I could have an impact, where I could start to invite other men who have maybe necessarily not felt like they had a voice in the conversation to the table. Because I know that's me. I knew I didn't feel like I had a seat at the table in the masculinity conversation. I knew exactly what would happen the second I launched my first episode, which was I'd be called a fag and say, what does this fag have to tell me anything about being a man in this world? What's this beta man have to do? I knew exactly what was coming my way. And I got to a point in my own healing journey where I decided, it doesn't matter if I'm given a seat at the table. I'm ready to take a seat at the table and say that I have something to offer, and I'm going to do it in my own way. And I'm going to continue to invite people to come into that space if they want to. I'm not going to force people to be there. And I'm also not going to continue to force myself to be in such uncomfortable positions where I don't feel like the work has been done to welcome me in. And so I think each of us as individuals can pick a lane for how we want to make change. It reminds me of when I was going through my social work program, we had to sort of pick direct practice or more macro level policy change social work. And I knew that I'm not going to be a policy driven person. While I want policy change, I'm going to be in the trenches with somebody. I'm going to be deeply one-on-one connected with people in the trenches, working on stuff, getting into the deep stuff. And so I think we all pick where our strengths are, where our vision is attracted to going to, and we start to bring our authentic, heart-centered leadership to the world.
So
I think that's wonderful. Yeah. And I want to honor you as well for the work you're doing around masculinity, because I understand what it feels like to shatter what we believe masculinity is as a concept, and to let that go and put it down. I think I've mirrored some of your experiences in terms of laying claim to masculinity as an idea or a concept. I spent most of my adult life assuming that I had no claim to the concept of masculinity, and therefore it wasn't accessible to me or available to me. And so, yeah, I just want to just say thank you, really, for the work that you do, because I think it's really important, and that throughout that process, so much of the language gets to be shifted and changed, and so many of the conversations get to be directed in a healthy way, and people get to step into all of themselves as part of the process, right? And I think that's wonderful.
Thank you for the kindness, and thank you for sharing the places where we connect. I think being able to see ourselves in someone else, and being able to have you reflect back that you see yourself in me in some ways, and that I get to see myself in you, I think in a sense is healing in itself, especially as men. I think we are taught to be so separate from each other. And so I think as queer men, we get to have our sort of physical intimacy with each other that is not allowed, or that straight men or cisgender heterosexual men are not looking for. But often that's quite transactional. And so being able to see ourselves in each other, there's an intimacy to that is, for me at least, is really healing. And it's something that I think is important for us as men to keep experiencing is that, oh, wait, I see myself in you. We're not so separate. We're not so different. We're not so far away from each other. So thank you for reflecting that back to me.
Thank you.
You know, one of my very favorite things about this podcast is that we get to meet people like you. And I think that your message is so extraordinary and so beautiful. And I hope all of our listeners find ways to connect with you. And we'll be providing all sorts of links in the show notes. But in general, how do you advise people start to get to connect with you? You have podcasts, you have social media, you do all this different types of work.
Yeah, I think the easiest place to go is my website at travisstock.com, because it has some information about the coaching work that I do, some information about the Equus coaching that I do, and it also has the podcast. All of the episodes are on their own page there, and so you can go to that and start listening to The New Masculine to get a sense of who I am, more of a sense of who I am, more of my value systems, the conversations that I'm holding, how I create psychological safety between me and other men is there. Also, I really encourage people to follow me on Instagram at Travers03. You can just look me up by my name as well, because it's where I'm sharing a little bit of my personal life, but I'm also having ongoing conversations around the new masculine and around the conversations that I'm having. So while the conversations that are recorded are a little bit static, now we get to participate as a community around what came up in that conversation. And so that's another really good place to connect with me there. So website or Instagram is really good places.
Wonderful. And like I said, we'll be putting all of those links in the show notes just to make it easy on everybody. So I encourage listeners to go check that out. Travis, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. It was such a pleasure to talk with you today. I think that there's so much health and joy and healing and the energy and love that you bring to the world. And you're such a bright light for our community. I really hope people take the time to get to know you. I think they'll be so inspired. And I'm just so grateful for your presence.
Yeah, that's incredibly kind. Thank you for the sweetness. And I just have really enjoyed talking with you both. And I am so glad that I've met a friend that lives like 30 minutes away from me, and then one that's coming to Seattle Pride is on a plane now.
This weekend. Yeah,
exactly. We'll be meeting up. So thank you. Thank you both for giving me space to share a little bit about my views on this topic that we seem to all be really fascinated around masculinity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, dear listeners, you have made it through another episode of Not Going Quietly. Thank you so much for inviting us into your home, whether that's on a podcast platform or on YouTube or on our website, whatever your platform of choice is. We really appreciate it. These conversations are so near and dear to our heart, and we hope that they are helping you reclaim a sense of sanity, grace, and peace during all of the upheaval that we are all experiencing. So on behalf of me and my co-host, Jonathan Beal, thank you so much. You've been listening to Not Going Quietly. Have a great day. Thanks.
You've been listening to Not Going Quietly with co-hosts Jonathan Beal and Britt East.
Thanks so much for joining us on this wild ride as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy.
Check out our show notes for links, additional information, and episodes located on your favorite podcast platform.